Thank you for joining us for a Level Access webinar on ADA Title II check-in. Are you really ready? With the enforcement beginning and with these regulations taking effect in just a matter of weeks, we're really excited to have you with us. My name is Corb O'Connor, Director of Thought Leadership here at Level Access, and we'll introduce our panel in just a moment. But to get started, I want to first go through a little bit of housekeeping items with you for today's webinar. Everybody is muted upon entry, so you won't have to worry about accidentally surprising everybody with a 2020 or 2021 moment. We do have real-time closed captioning available in the settings of the Zoom app here, whether you're on desktop at the bottom, clicking on captions, or on your phone on those three dots and turning on captions. We would love to have your questions, so please look at the Q&A box for those, similar spot to where you'll turn on captions. We'd love to get those questions gathered throughout the webinar. We'll gather those at the end and answer those then. We may be able to get to some throughout our session together as well, so definitely please don't hesitate to drop them in as you think of them. We will share this recording with all of you and with the slides as soon as we have that video file captioned and can share the presentation deck with you as an accessible PDF as well. So today, as we get started, I think it's really important that we talk about the moment, the unique moment that we are all in right now. So yes, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights and the Justice's Civil Rights Division have been reduced in size. But what I am excited to present with you is somebody who's no stranger to the Department of Justice, and Eve Hill is joining us. And I'm curious, Eve, for your reaction to that, the second half of what we have on slide here.
Well, the second half is that the risks of inaccessibility are actually growing more significant. We should be unhappy that the federal government is doing less enforcement because they were a key release valve for all the violations that are happening in the world, and they handled a lot of complaints. And now private lawyers are going to be handling those same complaints. The complaints won't go away, but private lawyers will handle them, and that can make it more difficult for covered entities.
So again, thank you very much for joining us. I, Corb, have been working with institutions of higher education on digital accessibility for about 20 years, and then also with other entities from state and local governments and the private sector for the last 15 years. And really, my focus has been around how do we make sure that accessibility is something that we do on a regular basis, that it's part of everybody's job, that it's not just a checklist item at the end of our process, and it's not just we do our work and throw it over to an accessibility team, but that each of us has a unique role to play in that work.
John Avila, Chief Accessibility Officer at Level Access. I've been with Level Access for over 25 years. I'm one of our thought leaders. At Level Access, I make sure that we are building and procuring technology that is accessible to our customers and employees. A lot of the work that I do is around accessibility standards for the digital environment to make sure that as technology evolves, the standards are also updated to keep pace with that, so we can ensure that people have something to measure what an inclusive digital experience looks like. I'll pass it over to Eve.
And I'm Eve Hill. I'm a partner at the law firm of Brown, Goldstein, and Levy, and a principal in inclusivity strategic consulting. I'm a disability rights lawyer of long standing and a consultant to entities who are trying to comply with the various federal and state disability and international disability rights laws. I have served 2 terms at the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division and have been working nationally on digital accessibility issues for years and years and years now. Back to Corey.
Thank you both for joining. So for our agenda today, we have 7 topics that we plan to cover. And so first, quickly about who we are as Level Access, but then quickly jumping into understanding ADA Title II and the regulations that will be taking effect. We want to make sure to spend some time on the common misconceptions about the new rule, and we're going to give you an opportunity for an interactive game show experience. So get your keyboards and mice and Dragon tools ready for a little bit of Zoom polls. We want to also talk about the enforcement outlook. You know, what happens after April? And then walking through a compliance roadmap with you. What is it that we recommend for covered entities to the action items you can take to mitigate the risk that you have? And we'll cover in there a little bit about too, what do you do if this timeline really doesn't seem like you're going to be able to comply in time. What is it that you can? What are the steps that you can be taking? We'll recap our takeaways, and then, as I mentioned at the top, we'll have time for your questions and answers.
So a little bit about level access. We have over 25 years of leadership in the digital accessibility field. We partner with the top 5 of the top 10 Fortune companies, and then also across many different industries, including finance, healthcare, education, public sector, and B2B companies. Level Access has over 500 employees that span 25 plus countries. So we are truly a global company, and that gives us deep regulatory experience globally, from Europe and the Americas to Asia and the Pacific. At the same time, we're creating advanced technology that combines expertise from humans along with AI-powered technology such as AI agents to help scale creation of inclusive experiences. And then lastly, we aim to shape global standards by our involvement with organizations like the W3C, which we are a member of. Okay, so now let's jump into understanding the new Title II requirements from April 2024. So as you likely know, the Department of Justice put out these the rulemaking, which comes into compliance next month for many public entities. So what's new about this? So the Americans with Disabilities Act has been around for over 35 years. But what's new with the Title II regulations are the addition of specific technical standards, and that is WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, level A and AA. And also the rulemaking is very specific about what types of things would need to meet those WCAG standards. And so that is really something that is new, and these standards cover things like web experiences, documents, mobile apps, etc. And the covered entities are pretty broad that are covered by Title II. So Title II is typically is going to cover things in the U.S. like state governments, local governments, higher education, public K-12 schools, that type of thing. So whether it be a city or county or a police department or a public health department or a public institution, those are all covered entities. And so this is really important for you all that are public entities and for folks who sell into public entities. The compliance date, as I mentioned, is next month for those with a population over 50,000, so 50,000 and above. And we'll explain what that population means in a few more slides. But there are smaller entities and special districts where the compliance date is a year from now. Moving on to the types of content and the exceptions. So as I mentioned, the rulemaking applies to things like mobile apps, websites, web applications, social media content, electronic documents. So these are things like Office documents. So think like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, slide presentations, as well as things like video that is pre-recorded or live, and also to third-party content that is funded, contracted, or otherwise arranged for by the public entity. And so this is really sort of very striking, because so many services and programs and activities today are delivered through third-party apps and services, whether it's a real estate assessment database or paying for parking, or a 311 app where you can resolve issues in your city, or riding the bus. So many third parties are involved with how we interact with public government here in the United States. There are some exceptions. There are exceptions for things like archived content, but those very specifically have to be truly archival content that's marked in a way and put in a designated area. There are exceptions for pre-existing documents that are not used for programs, activities, or services. There are also some exceptions for password protected documents that are about an individual or their account or property. However, if the individual is a person with a disability, they still need to be accessible to that individual. And there's some other exceptions as well, things like pre-existing social media. But in large part, a lot of things are covered. And so there is some confusion around different topics. And so we want to cover some of these common misconceptions and then talk about what you really need to know and why these misconceptions could cause some risk or confusion for your organization. So jumping in, we are going to put up some poll questions for you to answer. Do your best to answer them. No one's name is going to be shown. It's just the answers in summation that are going to be shown. And then after that, I'll read the question and the poll results, and then we'll have Eve provide some commentary about each one of these misconceptions. So true or false, the deadlines are based on the student population for an educational institution.
This is not limited to educational institutions, but for any kind of state or local government agency. Is the deadline determined based on how many people you actually serve, or is it the bigger part of the government that you're a part of?
Okay, so it looks like we have true at 19% and false at 81%.
So that's actually false. The deadlines are based on the population of the organization, the state or locality that the entity is an instrument of. So you may only have 10,000 students at your school, but you are part of a county with 60,000 residents. You're in the large category. You have more than 50,000 constituents. Similarly, you're an agency who only gets 250 calls, but you're a part of a state that has 1 million residents. You're considered a large entity and as being part of the state. So you look to the government entity, not necessarily the agency or school that you're running.
Right. The next misconception is true or false. Testing for digital accessibility will increase my risk.
And this we hear often as the question of, well, if I test all of my assets that are under my management, if I actually go out and look at all of these web pages, then I've created some evidence that I knew about these accessibility issues. So has that increased my risk, or am I on the hook regardless, is really where we're coming from with this question. That, and all of these, by the way, all these questions are ones that we are asked on a regular basis here at Level Access.
Okay, for the answer for the question, testing for digital accessibility will increase my risk. True, it came in at only 2%, and 98% of people said false.
Well, that's brilliant. It is false. Ignoring noncompliance will not save you. There is a no intent standard whatsoever under the ADA, so you are going to be responsible for fixing any problems, whether you knew about them or not. At least knowing about them gives you an opportunity to avoid liability. And then for damages, there's an intent standard of deliberate indifference, and burying your head in the sand and ignoring obvious problems sounds a lot to me like deliberate indifference.
Okay, next, true or false? Full conformance with WCAG 2.1 level AA is necessary for compliance.
John is one of the authors of WCAG. He's on the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and I always love when I get questions like this, and I think I know the answer, and then I go to John and say, do I really know the answer?
Okay, we have enough folks responded, and this is really a mixed one. We have 56% said that's true, and 44% have said this is false. So Eve, what is the answer?
Yeah, you're both right. It is true that there is no, you don't have to, there's no percentage, like I can get 70% of the way there and that'll be good enough. It is 100%, but there is a defense that barriers, if you can demonstrate that a barrier has such minimal impact on access that it would not affect the ability of individuals with disabilities to use the website or app, then you don't have to make something compliant. So this is usually for things that are purely decorative, that really don't affect how you use the website or app at all. And so those things may not have to be accessible because they don't affect the use of the website or app.
So it sounds like ultimately thinking about the user flow, can a person perform the task with their particular disability and their assistive technology? Can they perform the task is a really helpful question in helping people prioritize. Okay, let's move on to our next question. This is number 4 out of 5. True or false? If I mark content as archived, it is automatically exempt. Okay, it looks like the answers are just coming in. We have true at 12% and we have false 88%. Eve?
Right, it's false. You can't just label something archived and get away with not making it accessible. There is an exception for archived web content, but only for web content that was created before the compliance date, is kept only for reference, research, or record keeping, is kept in a special area for archived content, hasn't changed since it was archived, and you still have to make it accessible on request. So just you have to meet all the requirements to archive something. You can't just say, yeah, let's treat it like an archive.
Great. And final question, true or false? Password protected educational content does not need to be accessible if there are no students with disabilities in the class. And this is one that's come up because there was some originally in the proposed rulemaking, there was some discussion about how situations like this could be handled. And this has come up because of that proposed rulemaking is different than what the final rulemaking actually says. Okay, and let's see what the survey says. True, 13%, and false for is 87% of respondents.
So that is false. The notice of proposed rulemaking considered, the DOJ considered exempting password protected educational content, and they decided against that in response to all the comments. So it doesn't matter whether there are no students in the class. That just matters to the damages that you might be responsible for. What is required is that all of the content be made accessible regardless of who's in the class, because students with disabilities can show up at any time. They can transfer in and out of classes, and it takes a little time sometimes to make things accessible. So you can't put the students at risk when they show up of not getting their materials on time. We're going to look a little bit about what the enforcement outlook is going to look like after April. Federal enforcement may be light or may not, but private enforcement is going to be there to pick up the slack, and they're going to be after covered entities to make sure that they comply with this rule. The federal enforcement signals are not, people thought, and they come to me all the time, well, the federal government's not going to enforce this anymore because they've cut everything. And that's not necessarily true. We know that the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights has been cut, a lot of staff has been cut, but the digital team remains in place. So they're still doing this work. And the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has also lost a lot of staff, but they're still active in disability rights cases. They recently filed an objection to a $5 million class action settlement with Fashion Nova because they said it didn't provide enough monitoring and enforcement mechanisms, as well as they thought it paid too much money to the lawyers and not enough remedies to the individuals with disabilities. They also filed a lawsuit against a major transportation provider for not serving people who use wheelchairs and for not serving people who use guide dogs. So they are still in the disability rights enforcement business. Now, private enforcement is going to continue. We've already heard all about the many lawsuits and demand letters being sent and filed in the Title III context. Now that the web regulation is out, I expect that those private lawyers and private individuals will turn their attention to Title II entities, state and local government entities. And you are subject to risk of liability not only to people who are registered students or constituents or trying to do something, but you're also subject to possible liability to testers. And testers visit websites to confirm their noncompliance, even though they don't actually intend to access the goods or services. And testers in some cases have standing to challenge discriminatory sites. They usually can't get damages except under some state laws, but they can challenge the inaccessibility and demand injunctive relief, which, as we should talk about, damages are not the only result of a finding of liability. You also end up having to make your websites and apps accessible much more quickly than you might have planned to do, and to put a lot more resources into making the things accessible. You may also have to hire approved experts and lose out on your choice of experts to do the work. And then, of course, the big disincentive to violating Title II website rules is that if you lose, you have to pay not only your own attorneys, but the plaintiff's attorney's fees, and that can be substantial. Covered entities are responsible for damages under Title II of the ADA, unlike Title III, where you don't get damages under the ADA. The standard of intent, you are required to have intent, but the intent standard is deliberate indifference. Doesn't mean you have to have hated people with disabilities or wanted to hurt them or intentionally made an inaccessible website. It means you knew there might be a problem and you didn't do anything about it. And burying your head in the sand and ignoring obvious barriers is deliberate indifference. So the one thing that has changed relatively recently in the damages context under Title II is the Supreme Court held that you can't recover emotional distress damages for violations of Title II of the ADA. So no one can get emotional distress damages from the fact of being discriminated against by your website. However, a lot of other things can provide a basis for damages. So educational harms is a big one. And in the Los Angeles Community College District case, the judge and the jury found that the district was responsible both for injunctive relief, making the website and apps accessible much more quickly than they wanted to, and the jury awarded damages of $240,000. Now, the judge then reduced those damages, saying, well, some of that must have been emotional distress damages, which aren't allowed, but it's not clear that that was the case. And so the judge reduced the damages, and that decision is on appeal to the Ninth Circuit right now, and they're expecting a decision on whether those might have been educational opportunity damages, in which case they would be, the $240,000 damages would be upheld. And that was for 2 students. Florida State University, this is an earlier case, resulted in a damages award of $150,000 to 2 blind students. And then you may have medical harms. For example, the University of North Carolina healthcare system was sued on behalf of 2 blind patients, which resulted in $125,000 to those two patients. So there are non-emotional distress damages that are still available under Title II, and that can be quite substantial.
Let's look at a compliance roadmap, some action items to help mitigate risks. And we have several steps here, 5 steps, but they could occur simultaneously. And folks may be at different places in their journey. But just starting at the beginning, the first thing, if you're just starting out, you really do want to assemble a working group of people. You want to make sure you have the right stakeholders in the room. And so typically this is making sure you have support and buy-in from senior leadership, because this, in order for accessibility to really be effective, it has to be a change in the way you think in an organization and the culture and DNA of that organization. So you want to make sure there's clear roles and responsibilities. Once you develop your plan, you really do want to publish an accessibility statement, including policy and other information The accessibility statement certainly should include contact information, but having a clear policy, even if that policy is internal, to make sure that people know what they're accountable for, how to get help, and what is covered. In order for this course to be effective, budget is a key part of this, because efforts need not just people's time, but also tools, training, resources, platforms, potentially new software, those types of things that may require budget in order to be successful, and an ongoing sustainable thing. It's not a one-time budget and then you're done. Although if done correctly, can be minimized over time. And then the stakeholders that I mentioned earlier, making sure you have those people. So, for example, in a city or higher education institution, it may be disability services, the ADA office, likely compliance and risk. But procurement is really important, because so many of the third-party things we use today are procured or acquired from other sources. So making sure that procurement is covered is helpful. IT, obviously, but it's not just IT. Maybe your athletics website and your main website and your mobile apps. So it's a lot of different technical people that may need to be involved. As I mentioned, education teams, so training, whether you're a decentralized organization or a very centralized organization, training and enablement is really important. So all of your content authors who are creating Word documents know how to create accessible Word documents, and have the tools like our level access docs product that can help you make accessible Office documents and compliant PDFs from those. And then lastly, people with disabilities, employees and other constituents with disabilities, to get their input and feedback in the process. And on to step 2.
And so now that you've assembled that working team, we've got everybody in the room, and we're going to find out now, okay, well, what are they going to do? And the first step is the second step of the process. The first step of once you get everybody together is to really inventory your digital assets. So we want to start by considering the entire portfolio, not just the public website. So if you're a university, you might be thinking about your main.edu pages, your admissions pages, maybe some of your department pages. But it's also important to be thinking about what is the totality of that public experience with your institution. As I step onto campus, what digital things am I touching? What apps might I be using? What tools am I going to need in order to interact with the institution? If I'm a local county, it's not just about being able to find out when the trash picks up, but it might also include paying my water bill. It might also include things like engaging at an event and finding out that there's a newsletter that's sent out to everybody via email, making sure that newsletter is accessible, and all the things I click through to sign up or to sign my kid up for various sports throughout the summer and fall, making sure those are accessible too. And that's where really it comes down to establishing that criteria for prioritization. You might look at who is using this. Is this only going to be used by staff, or is this by the public? If in the public, what groups of the public are we really wanting to target and engage? If we have a campaign that's really looking to target people who don't have a particular type of service available to them today, that maybe that's one of the things we really want to target, so that as we're going out to a population that we know has a lot of folks with disabilities in it, that we make sure that those are ones that we're looking at. And then we're also looking at, is this public facing, and was this created by our organization or by a third party? And just another one of those sort of moments of confusion that happens with these regulations. Third party content doesn't mean that I didn't build it. Third party content in these regulations is really about, is somebody else that I didn't ask to do this, are they contributing? Are they maybe commenting on my Facebook post with an inaccessible, jiffy of in response. That's third-party content. But when you're thinking about prioritization, it's just as much your responsibility to be sure the things you've bought, maybe even the things that you've acquired for free because they're available to all institutions or to all counties in your state. That's still your responsibility, but it has a level of prioritization matrix that you need to be thinking about. There are things that you can control that maybe are going to take a little bit longer for your team to make accessible, or are going to require more assets and resources, more people. But if it's a third party, can we put some of the onus back on them to say we have a higher standard when it comes to content that we've paid for or tools that we've paid for and procured? Maybe again, tools we haven't paid for, but we still procured, that those are things that we're prioritizing from an accessibility perspective. And ultimately, as I'm sure Eve would comment on here as well, that your highest priority assets are really the ones that matter most for your users.
Thank you, Corb. You made a good point about public-facing content, employee-facing content. I just mentioned real quick that many states have their own state laws around digital accessibility that may apply to your public entity or the public entity you sell into. And so just keep in mind those state laws may have additional requirements for employee-facing or perhaps more stringent requirements for WCAG 2.2, et cetera. On to the third point here, which is developing an accessibility plan to sort of fill the gaps. You want to be thinking about, okay, what do we need to evaluate, and how will we evaluate those things? And it's a question more of prioritization. Maybe you can't do everything at once, but how do what should you evaluate? Whether it be automatic testing or manual testing or some set. And what are you going to remediate first? It's important to think about, okay, we need to fix things, but we also need to start creating things to be accessible from the beginning. So all new documents that we create should be accessible. All the new social media but should be accessible. At the same time, when you're thinking about fixing the existing things. And you want to think about the tools that you'll need to support you in those efforts, whether it's your development team or your content authors or your social media marketing team. Do they have the right tools? Do they have the right training and the budget? There's also different user impact and risk, as Court mentioned. Certain products or services might really be critical, whether it be healthcare or access to transportation or safety alerts. So thinking through those things will help you make a more informed decision. Also, focus on the things that are going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, which is like your templates, your component, those things that are reused over and over again. Instead of fixing every document that was created with the template, you can fix the template and then train people on how to use it properly. And then, you also want to think about, potential fixes, as well, and really try not to be reactive. Now that we're coming to the state, hopefully a lot of the existing things have been fixed. So let's focus on the future. And to do that, the next topic is procurement. And so getting accessibility into your procurement language, into getting that contract language around accessibility for your vendors, whether it be paid or acquired technology, is really important. Asking them for conformance documentation, whether that's in VPAT format or in some other format, and asking them to demonstrate accessibility of the products. We understand that not all products are going to be fully conformant on day one, but what does a roadmap look like? If you look at the conformance documentation, what are some red flags that you can easily spot to say, hey, it doesn't really look like this vendor knew what they were saying in their accessibility documentation. Maybe we need to follow up and figure out if they really understand accessibility, they really understand the needs. Because ultimately, when software companies hear from public entities that accessibility is a requirement and all the public entities are asking for this, then it really is it's a business driver for business to create accessible software. And it's also a competitive advantage for those selling accessible software. And then lastly, some of the things that we find that slip through the cracks is when you agree to a vendor contract, maybe you agree to a roadmap, but a year later you don't follow through with that. That is a challenge. So just make sure that you follow through and check on those accessibility things to make sure they are being done, and then to make sure that they continue to be accessible over time.
And I would say, that there's a little bit of a secret phrase that I found that's really impactful. So often those of us in accessibility, we're not in the decision-making role, but we're in the decision influencing role. And so we're a little cautious of like, what can I say to this vendor when I'm not the one who determines whether they stay or whether they go? But really to think about the question, here's the magic words. I don't know that I'll be able to support our renewal with you. Or if you want to be more direct, I can't support our renewal with you. Now, you haven't said that I'm not renewing, so you're not making any contractual obligations. Your support may or may not really matter to the decision maker. The vendor doesn't know that. And so when you send those kinds of notes and you have the right domain name and your email address, that right signature at the bottom that's got, your institution behind it, that's what makes vendors pay attention. That's generally when they start calling us. And what vendors are really doing is they're saying at that moment, gosh, there's risk in this contract, there's risk at this account. And especially true if you can say, hey, when we signed with you on August 1st, we discussed these barriers. Now that it's October 1st, it's interesting. I have somebody who's in the public. They're trying to access this tool. And lo and behold, they've sent this email to me, or they've given me this comment that they're not able to do these things. And those map directly to what I told you in August. What is the timeline for getting those addressed? You're being responsive to your constituents and to your residents. You're being, and you're holding your vendors accountable, and you're creating that paper trail that in December, right? Hey, we had an agreement that in the first quarter working with you, we're past the first quarter now. Here's what we expected to be different. And those are the kinds of things that will then make your life easier at the end of the day, at the end of the year, when you then go back to your decision makers and say, look, here is the evidence that we gave them. We weren't just saying WCAG 2.1 AA. We were giving them very tangible and tactical things to change. Here's their responsiveness or lack of responsiveness. It also gives you some ability to have a discussion if that does come before litigation, to be able to say, we were aware of this issue, we're working on this issue, we've been addressing this consistently, here's what we've been doing over time.
I didn't realize that one was for me, but okay. So it's really important to do a number of things. Providing accessibility training for the people who post on your website, who create the content. Don't forget the content creators. They need to know how to build things accessibly from scratch. And then your posters and your checkers have to have the ability to fix things that are broken. Make sure everybody has the knowledge that they need, as well as it's really important to provide them expertise when they encounter something that they can't make accessible themselves, that they have access to someone with greater expertise to help them. Audit and test, and then test again, and then test again, so you can see that progress is being made. And so these are really important, to not just to do automated audits too. Automated audits have their place, but they can't be the only thing you rely on. You want actual user testing as well, because automated audits overcatch some things and undercatch other things. And you need real people to make sure you're getting all the right information. Implement tools and resources. These are the things that people can turn to when they don't actually know it all by themselves, but tools for designers and content creators, tools for the people who post, tools for the people who audit and test, and tools for your leadership to follow up and know what it means when something is not making progress. Design and build with accessibility in mind. Stop digging. Make sure all the new stuff is born accessible and stays accessible. This is the easiest way to start to clean up your website, because your website is evolving all the time. The more new stuff you put on it that is accessible, the better off you are. Track your progress so you can show that we are taking this seriously, and more importantly, that you couldn't do it any more quickly than we're already doing it. This is really important. And then enforce your procurement policies through whatever enforcement mechanisms you have. So you can have contract language, you can have, we just can't contract with you anymore because you haven't met your goals in terms of accessibility. You have lawsuits over the contract. If you had contract language in there and they violated the contract, you have a contract breach claim against your vendor. All these things are going to be really important to have in your toolbox as you go forward.
How did I know the lawyer was going to bring up breach claims in this session? So I'm glad to hear it. And then the fifth step of this is really about sustaining your accessibility over time. So it's about bringing that feedback from users with disabilities. So often I will be talking with some of our prospective customers and I'll say, who have you heard from in your community or from your user base? And what have they told you about accessibility? You're a tool that sells to municipalities. I'm sure you've gotten some kind of feedback from your cities and counties about a user over time that had trouble. And a lot of times what we hear is, oh yeah, I do remember hearing something. It was last summer, but it kind of went away. Well, it went away because you weren't tracking it. And so having a system for your feedback mechanism that you might tag some things as accessibility, so that as somebody goes back and can say, we've gotten, it's not just one issue that made its way to the right product manager, but it's 4 or 5 times in the last year, we've heard about this particular product in this particular part of the product. We can then go and really have a uniform discussion. We talked with one customer a couple of years ago who told us that, each of their product managers, when they would ask, you heard about accessibility? And they'd say, yeah, once or twice over the last year. And what they realized was that none of these people were talking to each other. They had 6 product managers. They weren't hearing once or twice. They were getting 12 at least accessibility issues raised to their attention. And so making sure that you have a way to track that and collect that together. That you're validating, as Eve talked about, that adherence to your processes, that you can say to people who are doing a good job that, hey, we're going to give you some kind of certificate, some kind of brag, some kind of public announcement that you've done the work here. We're not only going to be coming after you when we find spelling errors in your document, we're going to find the people who are writing really crystal clear reports and really crystal clear things that people engage with. Let's do the same for accessibility. And then that demonstration of progress that Eve was talking about, that we can show the value of accessibility beyond just a risk mitigation, but we can show that we've made a change here that's made it more likely that people pay their water bill on time. Well, why are they paying their water bill on time? Because we've improved the user experience, not just for a small group of people with disabilities. We've made the color contrast better. We've made it easier to use when you're on your phone. We've made it easier to navigate with your keyboard. And suddenly, the reason people weren't paying their water bills wasn't because they didn't want to pay them. It's because we made it really hard to pay the bill. Well, when I can showcase that I can tie the accessibility work that we're doing to that ultimate progress that we care about at the end of the day, which is revenue coming into the city, that's what's going to make a difference. It's not just showcasing that we've reduced the number of accessibility issues. And then, of course, that we're finding ways to track that new content and regulation changing. So that as those regulations are evolving, that we can track that we're creating things new and that we're meeting that accessibility need. It's as much about each of us saying, you know what, I recognize that this new feature came out on iOS last week. And you know what, it's pretty neat. Our website already adapts to that mode because we were planning for it. We were tracking for accessibility over the last few months. We saw what was happening in the betas. And we've just been, maybe you're not even that geeky, but you're just reading about it in the mainstream press that this type of thing is coming. Dark mode is coming as one example. Now, is dark mode required under WCAG? No, but does it create a much better experience for some people with low vision and some people with a cognitive disability? Absolutely. And so when we can adapt to that changing standard over time and we're keeping pace with, hey, CAPTCHAs are frustrating for everybody. CAPTCHAs don't work if you are blind and deaf. They work great if you're blind or deaf in some cases, right? But what about if you're deaf-blind? Well, look at this. We've found some new ways to achieve CAPTCHA without having to have people pick the traffic lights that are in the minuscule box in that six square grid. So all of this sounds great. All these 5 steps, right, might sound like a great panacea. But what if we're still going to have these gaps come end of April? John, Eve, what's your advice to folks as they're thinking about, you know, what do I do as a go forward when I only have these next 7 or 8 weeks and I'm just not going to get there?
Well, don't give up. keep working and prioritize the things that are most important about your program. What you want to do is make sure nobody gets hurt because of an accessibility barrier, so that no one can get you for damages. The other thing you wanted to show is that you are working, that you started early enough, and you are working as fast as is possible. That so then the court can't order you to do anything faster because you're already doing it as fast as is humanly possible.
Yeah, that's good advice. I would just add a few things. Would be to make sure the new things you're creating are accessible from the start, so you're just not creating more technical debt for yourselves, and that you are aware of all of the things that are out there. Even though step 2 was like inventory, we find that sometimes people didn't think about something. They didn't think about the emails that went out, or they didn't think about this particular service, or they did some testing on the website, but they didn't set up a monitor, so it's not being monitored every 2 weeks for changes. So it's making sure that you just continue to make sure that you are finding those gaps and monitoring those things to make sure there's no surprises.
Thank you both. So we'll move to our key takeaways, and then we're going to move to answering some of your questions. Eve, I'll have you kick us off with our key takeaways from today.
Well, do the work. Keep doing the work right up to and past the deadline. It's all to the good in terms of reducing your liability. To keep doing the work, and importantly, to stop digging. Make sure new stuff is accessible. That's the easiest way.
And the second is to really incorporate that feedback from people with disabilities. Let those lived experiences drive what is important. You might be thinking that our webpage, our main site, man, there's so many accessibility issues, there's unlabeled graphics, but by and large, I keep getting requests from students who tell me, gosh, registering for classes is just so challenging. Housing application, I just can't quite complete this. Or the form I need to fill out to sign up for clubs and activities, I've got to do it every quarter and it's driving me crazy. That's the kind of thing that you would then, I would say, shift and say, yeah, it's not that our homepage isn't important. It's not that we have a compliance need for our homepage, but I have students actively telling me that their pain point is over there. Let's meet them where they're at, make that process more accessible and easier. One, it reduces your risk, right? Students don't want to go file lawsuits. They want to just be students. And so let's make sure that we're making that path easier for them while we're also thinking about our public-facing path.
Yeah, don't forget about the third-party content. Whether you're working with a vendor who you purchased from, or you're just acquired that technology, whether it's open source or some other method, make sure that third-party technology is going to be accessible, and that there is a way to work with that vendor over time to ensure compliance is met and remains compliant.
And then I would say, as a fourth point, to really focus on those high-risk assets first. So tackling everything at once, of course, is going to be challenging. But I think it's important to remember too that the prioritization decisions that we make also cascade throughout our institution. And so if we're picking on one department because of their pages, we want to make sure that we're aware that, hey, this is something we need you to be doing. But if that's not the high priority, the high risk piece for your organization, then maybe those notes to those parts of your institution are a little friendlier. They're a little less often. And you're focused instead on, we have a third-party management problem. We have an education issue that we need to solve of our teams that are creating content. We have a procurement gap. Those are the things that might be higher risk for you because you're in an organization that's frequently going out to third parties. You don't have a deep bench of IT support in your organization. So that's where you can have a bigger return on the investment of your time, is that don't be fooled by a report that's telling you you've got thousands of issues on this part of your website that may not get that much traffic, but really what you're foreseeing and you're able to see from your place in the organization is we've got a bigger risk coming. We're not monitoring yet. We don't have all the numbers yet, but you know what? There's a lot of contracts over there that we're not actively monitoring. John, can you give us these last two?
Yeah, absolutely. So you really need a platform to manage accessibility. This effort can't just be done in spreadsheets. It doesn't scale It doesn't provide you with the information for the leadership team to make the right decisions and to really know an accurate state of conformance. And so you really need an accessibility platform for you to help manage that and also to help build your program over time. So instead of being reactive and undefined and inconsistent, you can start to be repeatable and demonstrate that and refine your accessibility program to make it more mature. And then lastly, engage the accessibility experts. It's great you have an accessibility team and people, accessibility champions. That's critical. But at the same time, there's folks who know a lot of different things around accessibility and can accelerate your program, who can augment your program, be there to support you with the tools and experience, including experience by people with disabilities, who can really allow you to meet your program, your accessibility needs faster, with more certainty, and just, as an example, helping you evaluate whether your accessibility conformance reports you get from vendors are accurate, and validate that the experiences really are going to be usable by people with disabilities.
So time now for the promised questions and answers, and we'll try to do a lightning round of these to get through as many as we can. First one for you, Eve, is compliance perceived to be a process, and that you don't have to be 100%, but to hit the deadline, if you're making progress and you're showing that you have a plan in place and you're acting on it, is that good enough to have by the end of April?
Nope. You had 2 years to get it all in place. What I would say is, if you haven't achieved full compliance, but you are working on it as fast as can be done, then you may have an argument that you didn't have intent. We don't know yet whether that will fly as an argument that you didn't have intent. It may have an argument that it's an undue burden to go any faster, which you have to document in advance and lay out why it was an undue burden. You can't just make that up when you get challenged. So no, the ADA requires compliance, not just trying to comply.
And I think it's the similar question that we've heard about the European Accessibility Act. On the magic date at the end of April, April 26th, if memory serves. What's going to happen? Is this going to be a New Year's Eve moment? The ball drops and all of a sudden the fireworks come out of concern, or do you expect that day to be kind of come and go without much fanfare?
It's probably going to come and go without much fanfare, but but you have to understand that this obligation to ensure equally effective communication with constituents with disabilities has existed since 1990, when the ADA was passed. So 30-something years later, it's a little hard to argue, oh, I haven't had time.
John, a real fast one for you about do the strategies discussed today apply to those who are under the Health and Human Services 504 regulations that came out just a few weeks after these ADA regulations in 2024?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The rulemakings do have a lot of similarities in the WCAG requirements and the exceptions and things like that. And that rulemaking, which takes effect in May, applies to those who receive federal funding, and of course in healthcare. 504 more broadly applies to those that receive federal funding as well, but there may not be technical standards for those other areas like there is now with healthcare in those covered areas. One interesting addition that's covered by the HHS rulemaking is a kiosk accessibility, or at least access to the features that are offered on kiosks. And there may be some public entities like public health departments and university hospitals that have to, where both of these requirements may apply to them.
We've got a few questions around internal accessibility for employees, as well as public facing. So for example, somebody's mentioned here about a public web page versus a web page that's only used by staff for, say, e-learning. Or if there's a password protected site for employees, does that need to be accessible?
Not under this rule. This is Title II, which applies to the public-facing work of the agency. The internal employee-facing work is covered by Title I, which doesn't let you completely off the hook, but it doesn't require full accessibility in advance. You need to make things accessible for employees with disabilities, but not necessarily everything all in advance. You could still be responsible, but you have to, but you don't have to necessarily have a completely accessible intranet on any given date.
And I would just add that other state laws may include accessibility requirements. Some that come to mind include Colorado and Virginia and Massachusetts and Texas. So those may apply, and it may apply versions of WCAG 2.0 or 2.1, depending on the state.
Do those need to be on a section of a website just for the archive, or is it okay if those pages are scattered as long as each is marked as archived material?
We do not know the answer to that. The regulation says they need to be kept in a special area for archived content. It may be more than one special area. It's not clear.
And one last question that we have time for today. If instructional materials are found not to be accessible, can a lawsuit be filed immediately, or are institutions given a reasonable amount of time to make that content and material accessible?
Lawsuit can be filed immediately.
Excellent. Thank you for the quick answers, the very direct answers. John, Eve, really appreciate you both being here. We've got on screen QR codes to our 3 LinkedIn profiles. Would love to connect with you and continue the conversation. And really appreciate you joining us for this Level Access webinar. As promised at the beginning, we will get this video file captioned. We'll get the presentation slides made into an accessible PDF. Can tell you that they were born accessible, but PDFs are not always the most born accessible thing out there. But we've got that for you. We'll be sending that your way very shortly. And John, Eve, thanks for joining us on today's webinar, and thanks to all of you for making the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.